Good evening, everybody. I'm Yelena Campbell. Welcome to the history lecture series titled Challenging Gender. I would like to feature our special guests who come from Rainier Beach High School. Let's greet them with a round of applause. So far, we have explored how in 15th century France and 18th century Russia, some women, to achieve their goals, adopted what their societies perceived as male gender roles. Now we'll turn our attention to male poets in Mughal, India, who adopted female voices. Unlike in our previous lectures, today there will be no more tales of execution and spousal murder. To deepen our understanding of the role of gender in history, instead, we will discuss the themes of love, desire, spirituality, and ethics. Our speaker today is Purnima Dhavan, an associate professor of history. She received her PhD in South Asian history at the University of Virginia. Her first book, titled When Sparrows Became Hawks, The Making of Khalsa Martial Tradition, was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Currently, she is working on 2 book projects. Professor Dhavan has moved from studying warriors to poets and is writing a history of literary culture in early modern South Asia. Her second book project focuses on the environmental history of Upper Indus Valley. At the University of Washington, she teaches a wide range of classes, including courses on medieval and Mughal India, South Asian history, and global environmental history. Please welcome Purnima Dhavan.
Thank you, Elena, for that kind introduction. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge my deepest gratitude to our history staff and also to the staff members of the UW-AA who have handled all the logistical difficulties of all the complexities that involve putting together big events like this. This talk comes from a series of conversations I have had with students at UW. I was fortunate enough in the same year to work with Punjabi heritage students in the comparative history of ideas programs, where they wanted to talk about a whole range of Punjabi literary verse from northwestern South Asia. And in that same year, one of our fantastic graduate students in history, Adrian Crane, asked me to do an independent study on gender and sexuality in Mughal India. And I was very grateful for this opportunity because in that process, my students really pressed me to think about the contemporary afterlife of this poetry. And the fruit and work that emerged out of those conversations with my students is what I'm going to share with you now. So while you entered Kane Hall, those of you who were present while our video was running saw a performance by Hadika Kiani, a contemporary Pakistani artist, performing the verse of the 18th Muslim Sufi mystic poet, Bulleh. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, very less nuanced way of understanding Sufism would be it's a mystical tradition within Islam where practitioners strive to get closer to God through the use of prayers, interiorized contemplative and meditative practices, and music and poetry in South Asia at least is an integral part of this tradition. In this video, you saw a poem that was put to music which narrates the well-known folk Punjabi romance of Heer and Ranjha, which is presented through the voice of the female lover of this romantic dyad, Heer, which is set in the regions of Punjab, which is now exactly dab smack center in the no man's territory between India and Pakistan. The renewed interest in early modern Sufi or mystical forms of Islam in India and Pakistan today signals a growing interest in the gendered voices of these poets, both for the sympathetic subjectivity they brought to often idealized female poetic voice, but also because the poetry of Sufi mystics is seen by many today in India and Pakistan to speak with great empathy about ethical dilemmas and embody perspectives they admire. But indeed, many of these are quite different from each other. For example, just to give you the range of audiences we have for Sufi poetry and music in South Asia. Interest in Islamic mystical traditions is expressed by South Asian Muslims who value indigenous mystical traditions, but also by those who want to explore spirituality outside of established religions. They may not even be Muslims. Some are drawn to it purely as an aesthetic, musical, or literary level, and yet others who feel Sufi poetic traditions speak to their interests in feminist ideas or the self-expression of LGBTQ communities in South Asia historically. So it's a very, very wide and diverse audience. So the part I am going to draw to is the activism associated with it in South Asia today. To take you back, where does this process begin? By the 1990s, scholars and participants in the city of Lahore in contemporary Pakistan in the 1990s began describing the appearance of youthful audience participants in what had been a series of rites celebrating the death anniversary of Sufis. And the audience earlier had skewed rural and much, much older. One puzzle scholar of ethnomusicology described these new audience members as, quote, urban hipsters. Now, of course, they have become common at many Sufi shrines. In my talk today, I will speak specifically to these groups in this new audience who find inspiration in this very old poetic tradition to sustain and feed off their enthusiasm for feminist and LGBTQ activism, drawing inspiration from this older poetic core. So on the left here, you have from a very recent event in the city of Lahore, the very first Pride Parade, which was celebrating the recent passing of protective laws for the trans community in Pakistan. And on the right, you have a group that represents South Asia diasporic, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, LGBTQ actors, activists, Muslims in the city of London, right? So this is now a global and transnational phenomenon. More specifically, for these audience members, the poets of this period are viewed by some not as male, but as gender non-conforming. What began as the gradual and growing attendance of Lahore's LGBTQ community at Muslim Sufi shrines in Pakistan is now increasingly accompanied by a growing movement within Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and the greater South Asia diaspora in North America and Europe, which seeks to explore gender and subjectivity in culturally relevant terms by turning to a deeply familiar and beloved cultural form, Sufi poetry. This is not the first time a youthful group has embraced Punjab's Sufi poets for a political cause. As this talk progresses backwards into time, and I will draw your attention to the fact that in the next 40 minutes, we are going to journey from 1947 to the late 16th century, we shall see many other examples. The pre-modern mystic poets of Punjab also enjoyed a renewed burst of interest in the last decades of British colonial rule. Radical Marxist revolutionaries in Punjab during the 1930s and 40s in particular embraced them as symbols of a shared folk tradition that transcended the religious divisions between Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs that had become entrenched in colonial India. These revolutionaries, when arrested and brought before colonial judges, often refused to take oaths on scriptural texts like the Muslim Quran or the Sikh Guru Granth Sahib scripture, but instead asked for a volume of poetry by Waris Shah or Bulleh Shah, the two poets you see in the middle. Rejecting all established religions, 18th century poets such as Waris Shah were believed by Punjabis in the colonial period to embody a form of spirituality rooted in a shared mysticism accessible to Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs alike. In other words, they're not reading it as a specifically Islamic corpus. In a province such as Punjab, where no religious community enjoyed a demographic majority, For progressive writers such as Amrita Pritam, these pre-modern poets also held a symbolic promise to build a new future, even as the carnage of partition, which separated the colonial Indian state into independent India and Pakistan in 1947 and marked the end of colonial rule. In reaching out to long-dead poets, Pritam was intentionally following a path similar to Waris Shah and his contemporaries of the 18th century, in repurposing much beloved past poetic legacies for new inspiration and for voicing an alternative form of thinking, being, and acting distinctive from the normative values of many around them. In other words, this is still a patriarchal society. It is still transphobic and extremely homophobic. But for these poets, what they are doing is creating a space within that society. In particular, by switching and embracing distinctive gendered personas, the poets I will discuss in this talk were also enunciating a new ethical self and subjectivity that demanded an autonomous space for itself. The use of female voice and female subjectivity, and we will now have a little switch over, because while the poetic female voice might be working, alas, mine is failing. Bear with me. As I was telling my colleagues, a little confusion is good. This is what Sufis aim for. Keeps us modest, keeps us guessing, keeps us learning. Can everybody hear me now? Awesome. All right. So the use of female voice, yikes, and female subjectivity in many of these poems laid bare an uneven terrain of social power, often exposing the double standards, hypocrisy, and brutality by which patriarchal power replicated itself. It did this at a time when women themselves, with the exceptions of courtesans, did not recite poetry or perform music in public. In other words, what you saw our performer just do in contemporary Pakistan was not an option in earlier periods. And while many of these pre-modern poets evoke the feminine voice or persona with very different aims and through differently gendered self-presentation, each of them expanded the space within which this engendered voice spoke with authority of more ethically centered ways of being, one that changed with each era in which it was reinterpreted, as we shall see, but also tied together before and across time. To begin to trace the lasting influence of these poets, let us turn to the birth of modern India and Pakistan in 1947, a year that saw both the beginnings of independence from British colonial rule for those two new sovereign states, but also a trauma and genocidal violence of colonial India's partition, during which over 1 million Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims lost their lives, and about 14 million people were uprooted and displaced as refugees. Amongst those displaced during this religious and ethnic conflict was the poet and feminist author Amrita Pritam. Born and raised in a Sikh family in the province of Punjab, on what was now the Pakistani side of the border, Pritam and her family were forced to leave their home in Lahore, now behind the infamous Radcliffe line, somewhat arbitrarily drawn by colonial geographers. Recently married and expecting her first child with no home and no job, struggling to reestablish a home and profession, Pritam penned the opening line of her most famous poem, which is well known to Punjabi speakers now, Aaj Aakhan Waris Shah Nu, or Today I Call Out to Waris Shah, on a train heading out of Delhi in 1948 with the carnage all around her. This poem is a lament addressed to a fellow Punjabi poet, the 18th century Waris Shah, who had lived some 200 years in the past. Here you have the opening lines in English. I would like to actually give you just a taste of Punjabi, the only time I'll be doing this in this lecture. Aaj Aakhan Waris Shah Nu, kitton kabra vichon bol, te aaj kitabe ishq da koi agla barkha bol. This haunting, dirge-like poem would become Pritam's first major success. And to understand the truths it evoked for audiences across India and Pakistan in the 1940s, we have to get a sense of the poetic truths it placed before a Punjabi-speaking audience, reminding them of a shared cultural past they had once shared, which included Waris Shah's 18th century romantic epic poem, Heer. In the original 18th century poem, Punjab's countryside was presented as an idyllic pastoral backdrop to the emerging romance of its two main characters, Heer, which is the female, and Raja, which is the male hero of this verse. So these are pulp covers from the early 20th century, likely the form in which Amrita Pritam and her audience would have encountered these. And as you can see from the covers, it's a very idealized landscape. Both of the protagonists come from prosperous landowning families in Punjab. The hero of the piece, however, disguises himself as a low-status cattle herder, right? And then when you have descriptions of their romance in these poems, what is also being idealized is the landscape behind them, which is very pastoral, green, lush, and fertile, right? Pritam's word reminded her audience of how Punjabis themselves had destroyed the lush, fertile landscape of their home province, and the love that bound its communities together, so celebrated in its mystical verses, into a deathscape of corpses, ruined homes, and toxic nationalism. This hate-filled nationalism had also fueled sexualized violence towards its women, and in the same places where the fictional Heer and Ranjha had found love, Pritam's voice called out in great urgency to her predecessor, Waris Shah, asking him to rise up again from his grave. Quote, "When a single daughter of Punjab wept, you wrote and gave her voice to woe, but now 1,000,000 daughters are crying to you, Waris Shah." Indeed, as the poem continues, and you see the text behind me, the desolation of partition in Pritam's poem gradually overtakes the romanticized landscape of Waris Shah's lover. In the glades where Ranjha, the hero of this romance, played his flute to call his lover, in Pritam's verse, the rivers themselves spew poisonous hate, and where Heer, the eponymous lead of Waris Shah's work, flirted and played with her friends, desolation abounds. Calling out to the long-dead Waris Shah then unpacks for Pritam's Punjabi-speaking audience of 1948 a shared cultural world, which all Punjabis were familiar with. And this shared cultural world had been damaged considerably by the genocidal and sexual violence of partition. Further, it reminded listeners of the powerful female voice in mystical poetry in the persona of Heer, whose words of love and loss called them to examine their own actions and conscience that made them complicit in this orgy of poisonous hate. But what did Pritam's call to, quote, "open another page in the book of love," quote, as Waris Shah had done, mean? Invoking Waris Shah's name was an apt choice for 1948. It forced her audience to confront the violence of their own times, not through the lens of a single violent moment in partition, but as another chapter in the long battle between love and hate, epitomized in the poetry of Punjabi Sufi poets. This was also a new and feminist-inflected reading of Punjabi Sufi poetry by Pritam. So she's innovating the framework through which she's reading this poetry, which valorized Waris Shah, female heroine Heer, as a symbol of Punjabi women's suffering. Pritam herself would explore this at length in her novel Pinjar, the title of which literally means skeleton, told through the experience of a female survivor of partition. But her pointed allusion to Waris Shah in her poetry and in the novel also connected Pritam's poem to a longer discourse in Punjab that critiqued the patriarchal and honor-bound conventional morality of Punjabi society through poetic personas and fictional romances, as we shall see. More important, it was a discourse in which the female voice of Heer and the Heer-Ranjha romance was bold, questioning, and firm in resisting conventional forms of honor and gendered behavior expected of daughters and wives. Now, to give you just a brief plot, so you know what Heer and Ranjha are about, this is one of those typical star-crossed lovers like Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Isolde, right? Basically, the main points you need to keep in mind is the geography of this. Much of the action takes place smack dab in the middle of Punjab, right where the dividing line between India and Pakistan now lies, which is the home of Ranjha. But he falls out with his family, disguises himself as a lowly cowherd, and flees to Heer's home. Heer's family, who are known as ethnic Sials, are pastoralists with very, very large cows and herds. So they hire him as their cow herder. And Heer falls in love with him on first sight, announces to her parents that, in fact, she does not want to have the nice arranged marriage with the high status person who's been picked out for her already by her parents, but instead wants to marry this boy she just met. The parents, needless to say, are not thrilled with this choice. Much of the dialogue of this poem is really about Heer sticking to her guns. Several elders from the village are called in, including the Muslim priests, etc., to kind of knock some sense into her. But she keeps resisting. And in Waris Shah, this takes a very, very long kind of narrative part of his version of the romance. Finally, they give up. They gag her and tie her. And she is not actually allowed to consent to her own marriage, which is against the Sharia, right? And she is packed off to her in-laws. By now, Ranjha has given up in the Waris Shah version, right? But Heer tells him to basically grow a spine, come and rescue her, which he does. She then manipulates them to get an audience with the local ruler, who says a marriage made without consent is no marriage at all, right? She's let go. She's preparing for her final marriage back in her hometown with Ranjha. But her family is then told by various interfering busybodies and relatives that they have lost face, they have lost honor because they're letting the women in this family get away with too much. And she's poisoned by her own family and dies. On hearing this news, Ranjha also abandons. You know, the action was going well for a while, but the end is a real downer, right? Okay, so what are we going to do with this? To try and understand why Waris Shah's poem was so evocative for radical revolutionary and feminist authors in the 40s and 50s, we need to first ask the question, why did people like Amrita Pritam believe that a male poet was actually capable of fully expressing and voicing in an authentic way the female subjectivity of of Heer, right? So let's get a sense of where Waris Shah is drawing his own cultural tropes in the 18th century, right? I'm going to give you a kind of short primer on poetics. So India, and this is the case in the medieval period, is a place which has over 25 to 30 major language groups. I'm going to call them, in a generic way, Indic languages. The one I'm talking about specifically, though, Punjabi is spoken in the Punjabi Northwest. And there is a tradition both in secular and religious poetry. When you speak of love, you only speak through the female voice. This is particularly important because the female lover is supposed to embody in this tradition a steadfastness and an unwavering commitment to romance. Now, you have 18th century depictions of this, which are very schematic, but they're supposed to basically encode what the viewer is supposed to understand out of this particular romance, right? One of the reasons Sufi poets in particular are attracted to these Indic traditions is in part because embodying the female voice and voicing it in their own works means they have to let go of all the privilege men in this patriarchal society have, right? So in this religious viewpoint, the only male in the universe is God, all the rest of us are female, right? But lest you think this is some kind of emancipatory thing, I will point out that in fact this tradition is fairly ambivalent about gender hierarchy, in the sense that it is still looking at hierarchies of gender in a fairly kind of power-driven way, with men at the top of this hierarchy and women at the bottom, right? But situationally, in some ways, poets can make this work. For example, the only well-known female poet of the Mughal period, Mirabai, who was a Rajput princess, abandons her home and goes out into the universe, and she's hoping to commune with like-minded devotees. And she happens upon a religious teacher she really wants to have a heart-to-heart discussion with, Rup Goswami. He refuses to meet her because he says, well, I have taken vow of celibacy, and therefore I do not meet women. Upon which Mira's pithy reply was, that's odd. I thought God was the only man. So really, the subtext here is, you are not a religious person. You have not sufficiently humbled yourself if you still think of me as a woman and you as a man, and you're afraid of lust interrupting this particular spiritual devotion, right? Now, how is the Virani, this female lover who's pining for her beloved, depicted? Usually, as you can see in the picture, she is shown as very pale, made weak from her depression and her longing, and is somebody who takes no interest in life. So in the Heer Ranjha cycle, very often this is, when it was depicted by other poets, would mean almost all the action would be narrated by the female companions, right? Their job is to try and tempt her away from this depressive love, but in fact, the female lover is supposed to hold true. So what is interesting in Waris Shah's version of Heer Ranjha is Heer, in fact, is not passive. She is not completely accepting of this particular trope, and in fact shows every active attempts to change the destiny that this narrative piece has pushed her into, right? The other interesting fact that Sufi poets pick out of this tradition is that this is not just a spiritual love, right? As in many other Indic courtly and religious tradition, eroticism is very much part of this tradition. So that period of separation and pining will always be followed by actual union, which may be a union of souls, which is how most teachers like to present it, but in actual text is often a very erotic passage of actual sexual union, right? So this is one tradition that Waris Shah and his Sufi poets are drawing on. The other tradition they are drawing on is from Middle Eastern traditions, but specifically the Persianate world, in which you already had a 700, 800-year history in South Asia of love romances from the Middle East, like the famous Layla-Majnun, who are very much like Romeo and Juliet. These narratives, however, are very different from the Indian folk romances, right? For one, much of the action actually centers around male heroes. So for here, you see Majnu, who is grieving for his love whom he has lost. And a lot of the action and plot devices are told from that male perspective. Now, the interesting thing about Persian is, unlike Indic languages in which everything is gendered, even the plural forms, so you cannot have they, them in Indian languages, and specifically in Punjabi, those are gendered terms. Persian is completely ungendered. It has no gender at all, right? So it leaves the poet with a great deal of flexibility in terms of talking about the gendered identity of the lovers in these romances, right? But in this tradition too, all the romances have bad endings. And death is not something to be mourned, but death is to be celebrated because it embodies in a symbolic way the union of the soul, the human soul, with the divine, right? Which is what Sufis, after all, are hoping to achieve. Now, a little bit of understanding about why these two traditions get mismatched together in many different cultural settings. In South Asia, a lot of Sufis began to read and elaborate a doctrine that had been first put into motion and into text by the 12th century Spanish mystic Ibn Arabi. And I find it interesting that both of these traditions come out of regions that have a lot of cultural mixing, right? So in Spain, we have the convivencia with the Muslim, Christian, and Judaic traditions. In South Asia, we have even more religious diversity with elements of Hinduism, Islam, and Sikhism, for example, in this Punjab, right? These Sufis believed that you could not separate God from God's creation. And the Arabic term they used for this was Wahdat al-Wujud, which translates very loosely as the unity of being. In other words, this was a justification by the Mughal period of arguing that humans, as part of creation, could not be separated from divinity and the divine plan. And therefore, human love was a form of divine love as well. However, it was being expressed. By the 1500s and 1600s, as we will see, influenced somewhat by Indic traditions, this idea was also then articulated that erotic love could be a form of Sufi spiritual love as well, right? This is very, very different from the Christian mystical traditions in which spiritual love always remains at this higher spiritual sublimated plane, right? Sex and eroticism usually does not play a part in it, although you might actually have very, very erotic verse like the Songs of Solomon that Christian mystics use. But this was supposed to say at the theoretical abstract plane. You were not necessarily supposed to see this as instructions for a better life, right? So this is the key part that our Sufis in Punjab are going to pick up in the early modern period. And in particular, one thing the Persian tradition shares with the Indic tradition is this idea that landscape should mimic whatever emotional state the poet is having, which is what Pritam was drawing on. So here, Majnu has gone literally mad from grief. That is what his name means in Arabic. And here you have a landscape that has also become disordered, with deer and antelope sitting down with jackals and tigers. Because in their grief, everybody is now one with God and the divine soul. Grief is what brings people together. But it is a grief that can only be caused if you have deep love, right? So grief, love, union are kind of all oddly connected within this tradition. All right, what do the poets do with this when they talk about the Heer Ranjha tale? And every Sufi poet tackles the Heer Ranjha tale at some point, right? If they are drawing on the Persian tradition, they can subtly manipulate it in many different ways. So this is a book cover of Afsane Najmabadi, who's a scholar of Persian literary traditions, very intriguingly called Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards. And it's looking at gender expression in Persian poetry. A lot of the tropes for Persia would be true of India in this time as well. One of the things that's interesting to note here is that not only that Persian is not a language with gender, but the way the idealized form of the male lover and the female lover are described textually and pictorially is virtually the same. They have this round, what is described as a moon-faced beauty. I know moon-face is not very attractive to English speakers, but that is how it is described in Persian verse. They have this unibrow, of which Persian poets have lots of lovely things to say. And in addition to that, the fuzzy down on the cheek of the beloved, which could be the mustache on the woman or the enveloping fuzz on the teenage male lover's cheek, is also charged with erotic interest. But not only that, it is seen to represent the Persian letter, Arabic letter lam, which is like an L that dips like a fish hook, right where your beard would go, right? And that in itself is symbolic of Allah, right? Now, you've had this little tutorial. Let's see how this actually works in poetic practice, right? Here is a contemporary performance of the Heer Ranjha romance in Karachi, performed by the Dastane-Ishq Theatre 2 years ago. And I am going to read you the verses they are performing. So at this point in the action sequence, Heer is being forced by her mother to accept the arranged marriage and give her up her cowherd lover, who is of very low status. And she has brought in a qazi, a Muslim judge who's supposed to solemnize the marriage, who's now going to tell her that she really needs to just clean up her act and do what her parents are telling her to do. So here's the qazi. If you care to live, submit to the law, the qazi pronounces. This is from an English translation of Waris Shah by Sansik Sekho. Keep true to the faith, and after death you may be admitted to paradise. Put on the veil of modesty. Why should you wear the sack of shame? So the qazi then begins to coach Heer on what dutiful daughters in a Muslim family are supposed to do. Stray not from the path marked by Islam, and from your heart root evil out. Lay no more store by this beauty and youth. Like spicy wine, they go to the head. The Lord's command, O peasant girl, to man, woman should be wed. But Heer's perspective, like all the lovers in Sufi poetry, is to view the world sideways or from below, not necessarily from the conventional morality imposed top-down by parents and spiritual leaders. Heer responds, the believer's heart is the seat of God. O Qazi, do not demolish his throne. Where the love of Ranjha has lodged itself, the khera, meaning her arranged marriage husband, cannot hold sway. Why should I sell my faith indeed for life and must fall a prey to death? Listen to my plea of faith. My father and mother may break their pledge, but I am Ranjha's troth in fine. Where does, O sir, the book allow, she's now referring to the Quran, that one may break one's promised word? I have given up all support and rest my hope in the merciful Lord. But the qazi, of course, is not interested in helping Heer make an ethical choice about her obligations to Ranjha or her family. In Waris Shah's version, the qazi only wants to ensure his community's honor and not have Heer disrupt the normative chains of obedience of daughters towards her fathers, or to himself as Heer's spiritual guide. Heer wants none of this. In Waris Shah's 18th century version, she is quite capable of reasoning out what the right thing to do is on her own by using her heart as a guide. In fact, she is able to call out the deeply unethical counsel of the Qazi, who would prefer that she lie, break her vow to her intended, and then deceive her own groom, who is chosen for her, because of course she's already consummated her secret marriage to Ranjha, which in this time would have been a no-no. Waris Shah's Heer goes on then to chastise the Qazi quite boldly. Quote, "The wicked must ever be planning to put asunder hearts made one in love, that they should be bribed to sell their faith, even Qazis like you, learned and wise. God wants them maybe to feed the fires of hell, so sinners even have a use. I find myself caught in a trap and hardly know what to believe." And then she goes on to chastise him quite soundly, right? And here what she's doing is something that Punjabi culture remembers her for. In fact, if you go and look at lithographs from the early 20th century and late 19th century of this romance, all of them illustrate the verse I just read with this picture of Heer actually bashing the religious judge with a stick, which interestingly enough never actually happens in the actual Waris Shah romance. But this is the power of the female voice that Pritam is alluding to. Because the persona of Heer is voiced so rebelliously, so firmly, and so openly questioning of conventional morality and sexuality, that the Heer that people remember of Waris Shah's verse is this Heer, rather than the much more reasonable voice that I have read to you from the translated text. All right, so when does Heer actually use a switch? In fact, she does not use it on the Qazi. She uses it on her own lover Ranjha for his impudence towards her at one early part of the narrative, and at the end towards her uncle because he is harassing the young women in the village, right? This role reversal persists through the end of this epic romance, where Heer proves to be much more steadfast, focused, and true to her ideals than almost any other character in the work. Almost all throughout the thing, her parents, even Ranjha, her lover, at some point abandon hope. Heer never does. She knows what she wants and she's going to get it. She does this actively in both words and deeds, and it's only through treachery in the end that she is killed by her own kin. This image of Waris Shah's Heer, this passionate, outspoken, intent agent of her own destiny, is likely what attracted feminist readers like Pritam in the 20th century to this 18th century character. Waris Shah, as early as the 18th century, very uniquely, was keen to point out that concerns of honor and respectability were profoundly selfish and unethical, perhaps even immoral for a good Muslim. Heer's family was concerned about the honor of the family and protecting their status and reputation, caring nothing for their daughter's happiness. Heer's father threatens to kill her frequently in Waris Shah's poem for not obeying him, and intervenes constantly through other relatives, including her resentful uncle, who eventually poisons her. Here is an illustrative dialogue from the villainous uncle to justify his actions, and you can get a sense of how Waris Shah creates this villain. Quote, "This girl is a blot on our good name, and the trail has traveled far and wide. We lose our honor to send our daughter with our own cowherd as his bride. These people repay kindness with ill, and winning our confidence betray us. Infamy of daughters destroys households, as vices of sons and foul tongues may. The law allows the killing of such, and men of honor will not desist." Here we get a clear sense that for this community, marriage is a means of replicating power, forging political bonds, and violently curbing all opposition, even to the extent of permitting honor killings of wayward daughters. Throughout this piece, Waris Shah sets up a critique of both honor killings and the parallel practice of female infanticide by using Heer's experience and voice in this 18th century piece to get their audience to identify not with the patriarchal clan elders whose values the audience likely shared, but with the intended victims of their brutality. Only at the end does Waris Shah speak directly to the audience in his own voice, reminding them of their own late 18th century political context, where the once mighty Mughal empire that had ruled all over India had been replaced in Punjab by the rule of Jat peasants and other low-status peasant groups. Waris Shah's last verse sums up the futility of status-occupied honor politics, reminding his 18th century audience of the upside-down nature of the world, where power crumbles without love to hold it. On the tree of life, quote, many birds have sung, none have made it a permanent nest. Tyrants have ruled over vast domains, shiftless they had to leave the world. Poets alone can judge this poem's worth. The highborn have been put to grief, and lowly peasants are on the spree. They have become lords of the land. New governments rise in every part. So much for the honor politics. Waris, those who read the holy word will sail safely to eternal life. Waris Shah's bold questioning of honor politics of his time and his embrace of the female voice in Heer's characterization appear novel. But it is important to remember that already by the 18th century, even more dramatic challenges to gendered norms and honor codes existed, which likely inspired Waris Shah. Indeed, many earlier Sufi mystics had taken the Heer-Ranjha romance and reinterpreted it, sometimes to the extent of modeling not just the literary female voice as a theme, but as their actual public and gendered self, as the female lovers of a male divine. So, if we get to the poetry of Bulleh Shah, the third poem in our group of four, we observe a transition from a poet voicing Heer to embodying Heer. And Bulleh Shah often dressed in women's clothing. This modern reenactment in a play celebrating his life, of course, had toned it down. In the actual poetry, he dresses in bright red and puts on anklets, bracelets, and jewelry. In a manner very different from Waris Shah, but almost contemporary with him, a little earlier in the 18th century, Bulleh Shah composed several standalone Punjabi poems in Heer's voice. The most famous is this memorable couplet, through repeating Ranjha, Ranjha, I have now become Ranjha, call me Dhido Ranjha, let no one call me Heer. And this is a trope all throughout Bulleh Shah's poetry, where he'll explore one gender, then the other, and then reject both, because really both genders should be one, right? This idea of the unity of genders is very important to Bulleh Shah. It is not only in these poems that Bulleh Shah voiced a female perspective. Bulleh Shah hagiography, as well as the biographical narrative poems, describe the Sufi adorning himself like a bride in red robes, putting on bangles and ankle belts to dance before his beloved, his spiritual preceptor and mentor, Inayat Khan, as reenacted in this contemporary play. All throughout these pieces, Bulleh uses both male and female pronouns, intentionally using gender ambiguity both in literary persona as he appears to have in his actual life. For Bulleh Shah, the female voice was not merely a literary trope or plot device, but presented a true reflection of his passionate feeling and inner world. Even more, many other of Bulleh's poems argue that gender itself is illusory and worldly. The Bulleh Shah and Inayat Khan, these two lovers, are one. Bulleh Shah's poems meditate on this theme using the first letter of the Arabic alphabet, the Aleph, which is a straight line like the Roman numeral 1. Quote, that is enough learning, friend. Your learning may be beyond reckoning, but all you need is Aleph. In other words, you don't need an alphabet, you only need one letter. There is no trusting in life which departs from us. That is enough learning, friend. Reading and reading, you amass heaps of learning with the Quran and the scriptures all around you. You are surrounded by light, but there is darkness within you. Like Waris's fictional Heer, the real-life Bulleh Shah urges listeners to reach for deeper truths beyond mere letters on the page. And for Bulleh, these truths are only accessed through love. Letters are useful symbols, but they must, to continue his imagery, be sensed rather than read. Quote, when I studied the lesson of love, I beheld the ocean of unity and entered it. I got caught in its whirlpools, but Shah Inayat delivered me to the other side. And he references his lover Shah Inayat many times in his poetry. Ruefully, in other poems, Bulleh mentions the shock and dismay of his well-born aristocratic family, who traced their descent to the Prophet Muhammad, who felt shamed by his unorthodox behavior, and his open adoration for his teacher, a low-born Aryan of a gardening caste. They also, of course, were shamed by his behavior, appearance, dress, and gendered persona. This worldly obsession with outward forms, status, and Bulleh Shah's understanding keep people from seeing their greater unity with both each other as well as with divine creation. Another theme in Bulleh Shah's verse is that love reduces all these differences and fleeting emotions to a single unity, but an obsession with external differences of gender, honor, caste, religion lead one to be constantly bewildered. In a riddling poem, Bulleh Shah poses himself as both the listener and the responder. He asks, Bulla, ki jaane mein kaun, which may be translated in English both as Bulla, what do I know about myself, but also, what does anyone know about themselves? And he answers, quote, you will see a video later on where this is going to be performed by a contemporary rock artist in India. I am not a believer in mosques, nor do I follow the rites of unbelief. I am not among the pure or the polluted. I am not Moses or Pharaoh. I am not in joy or in sadness, nor in pollution or purity. I am not in water or of earth or of fire or of air. I am neither an Arab, nor from Lahore, nor an Indian from the city of Nagaur. I am not a Hindu nor a Muslim Turk. I know myself to be both, first and last. I do not recognize myself. No one is wiser than me. But Bulla, who is that Lord then? He's asking himself, who am I? This poem, which leads with a question and ends with a question, resists easy translation, but it perfectly captures the Sufi's mystic comfort with the great unknown and resistance to the restricting forces of any social labels concocted by limited human understandings, formed by human perception, or the binaries of social identity. So if we step back from these two well-known Punjabi mystical poets I have discussed of the 18th century, Bulleh Shah and Waris Shah, we can see why their poems still appeal to modern listeners. In their own time, Waris Shah and Bulleh Shah had resisted the normative values of their communities. They used the feminine voice, both through fictional dialogue in the case of Waris Shah, or through overtly biographical poems in the case of Bulleh Shah, presenting an uncompromising critique of an honor-based society that replicated its power through patriarchal clans and strict gendered norms of behavior, as well as institutionalized formal religion. This had a resonance with audience over several generations, which still confronted honor codes that reinforced gender discrimination and police sexuality. The poetry of these Sufi poets proved to have a lasting impact. So here are images of the celebration at Bulleh Shah's tomb today in contemporary Pakistan. You can see Qalandars here who dress up very much in the way described by Bulleh in his own poetry, often indulging also in very gender non-conforming behavior in the rituals of this tomb. Memorized and performed in oral tradition, honored by shrines that became pilgrimage spots, even believed to sanction similar patterns of non-conformist behavior by their devotees. This differently gendered Sufi voice judged social order to be actually oppression, family obligation to be a worldly snare, established religion to be hypocrisy. If from a worldly perspective, erotic world love needed to be disciplined, controlled, and policed to maintain social order, from the Sufi perspective presented by these two poets, erotic love was necessary chaos. It humbled the ego, it reduced proud male heroes to more appropriately devotional and connected them in an enchantment and rapture with the divine. Physical love was so intimately connected in these narratives with divine union that the world could not be seen as a duality of body or spirit, or as in other forms of Christian, Islamic, and Hindu piety, where body and spirit are always separate on a binary, but one where body, spirit, and soul were finally brought in synchronicity with each other through the practice of erotic love. Here, in using this gendered perspective to guide their listeners to another perspective steeped in the politics of Wahdat al-Wujud, or the unity of being, Waris Shah and Bulleh Shah were staking out an innovative and novel perspective from an earlier generation of Islamic mystics who did not see the body and spirit as dueling halves, but one in which the spirit was connected. In other words, the spirit did not have to master and discipline the corrupting influences of the human body and its lustful desire, but the spirit had to embrace and become that desire. So where are these two 18th century poets getting their own inspiration from? Here I will turn to the last poet in this dyad, the famous Sufi Shah Hussain, who actually always signs himself as Madho Shah Hussain to incorporate, and here they are buried side by side, his Hindu lover Madho Lal and himself in his poems, partly because he believed the poetic love poems was commemorating their actual physical love for each other, but also using this male-male erotic love as a pathway to God that would then lead practitioners, admirers, and students towards divinity itself, right? Now, this is very different. In early mysticism and Sufi traditions in India, in the Middle East, and elsewhere, there were very strict rules of behavior. Even in poetic and music gatherings, the usual advice given, for example, by Nizamuddin Aulia, the very influential Chishti Sufi of 12th century India, was that a performer in a musical ceremony must never be beautiful, must never be female, and should always be old and ugly as much as possible. Because music and dance is not supposed to titillate the senses, it is supposed to help you towards this meditative, contemplative state. But as I will point out, this is not the love that many of these Punjabi Sufis are celebrating, and many of these earlier Sufis are really from low status group. Shah Hussein's family himself was from a low caste weaving family prior to their conversion to Islam. Oddly enough, unlike the other poets, we know a lot about Shah Hussain because his works actually are spoken about in Mughal courtly records. Not only that, one of Madho Lal's, so the Hindu lovers, childhood friends, decided to write a long narrative verse in Persian poetry in which all the homoerotic tropes of Persian poetry is used to celebrate the love of these two men. So in closing, I'm going to read you a short verse in which this narrative poem attempts to describe what the physical love of these two men has to offer Muslims who are seeking spiritual guidance, right? So this is from the poet Hussein's biography called Hakikat al-Fuqara. In other words, it translates as those who have been impoverished by love, right? Quote, "When you look at these true men embracing, don't think that you're witnessing a sin. Their play of kisses are ripples from an ocean of guidance, not from selfish lust. Their aim is greater than that. He wants to burnish within Madho the passion for God. He plays this love off against that love, intensifying each other." In other words, erotic love and spiritual love are not opposed. They mutually reinforce each other. All right. Let us go back and see this living tradition. So much like Bulleh Shah, Madho Shah's tomb in Lahore still gets a complete attendance of people celebrating this through song and dance. But unlike the medieval period, we increasingly have female practitioners. And there are very few places in South Asia where this kind of mixed gender interaction is allowed. So that is an interesting new formation. And of course, in many of these traditions, we can now see how each generation of poets speaking and drawing inspiration from the previous generation is doing something new and innovative. In other words, they're not just simply reworking the same literary tropes. They're drawing new meanings and new frameworks every time. As we look back on the world of Sufi mystical poetry in Punjab or India or the Islamicate world more broadly, we see many individuals and groups reaching back to this cultural legacy, much like Amrita Pritam, but with different ethical debates and goals in mind. While Pritam had wanted to reach back to the shared legacy of Punjabi Sufi poetry to push back against the tide of religious violence and sexualized violence unleashed during partition, she also wanted to remind her audience that the everyday violence of honor codes subjected women to even more brutal forms of abuse during conflict were also being played out in an everyday setting, a theme she explored first in her poem to Waris Shah and more in depth in her novel Pinjar, based on the life of a partition survivor. In the 1930s and 40s, Sufi works were enjoying a renewed period of popularity amongst radical revolutionaries, as we have discussed. And as such, Pritam was one among many who celebrated and reconnected with this corpus. For the activists of the 1940s, the human subjectivity of Heer was a more progressive, questioning, ethical voice, different from the norms of institutionalized Islam, Hinduism, and Sikhism of their own time. But as I hope this talk has illustrated, Even 18th century poets such as Waris and Bulleh, in voicing the female Heer through their own literary personas, were pushing back against the role of erotic love in mystical practice by using a specifically engendered voice, and in the case of Bulleh, an ambiguously gendered persona, to make a place for human desire, both love and eroticism, and accepted and normalized routine form of mystical devotion. They reached out to an even earlier inspiration drawn from both Indic and Islamic traditions, sacred and courtly themes, and notably in the early example of Shah Madolal Hussain, to accomplish this. If we turn to the present, the embrace of Sufi and music and poetry by Indian and Pakistani artists continues this theme to speak to ethical debates on a range of issues in their own time, from the subjectivity of women to communal violence, or recapturing non-elite regional forms of Islam. Most notably, the growing attendance of LGBTQ communities at the festivals of Sufi shrines, such as that of Madholal Shah Hussain in Lahore, and their reclaiming of specific Sufi figures as iconic predecessors, points to the deep wellspring of empathy that mystical traditions in India have provided and continue to provide for people imagining a more ethical future in which they can all be included and valued. And to end, I'm going to leave you with a short clip from an Indian performing artist, Rabi Sher Gill, who's a practicing Sikh, recreating the words of Bulleh Shah. Those of you who have questions can now pass them up, and my colleague Elena Campbell will be collecting and running the Q&A.
Thank you, Purnima, and it's time for questions. Let's begin with a comparative question. And I wonder if you could elaborate on the understandings of a relationship between body and soul in Christian and Islamic mystical traditions.
All right, so very broad question. Let me try and attempt that. Sufi traditions are not homogeneous. They are very, very different and have a great deal of diversity within them. So as I referenced, an earlier generation of Sufis prior to the ones I have talked about often thought that spiritual love, in order to remain pure, had to then not include any lustful feelings, right? So any romantic love stayed at a spiritual literary level. It did not need to be actually practiced out. What's different in terms of the poets I discussed in my talk today is very clearly they are not doing that either in their literary work, and in some cases, as we see with Madhur Shah Hussain and possibly Bulleh Shah, in their own biographical tellings, it is very clear that they see human erotic love as running parallel to a divine encounter, and arguing that, in fact, it is the sensory perception and inhabiting an embodiment of that love that actually opens the human heart to new possibilities, right? And for them, then, the practices of the body and the spirit are not bipolar opposites. So for example, when Charity Urbanski talked about the Christian mystics and monks and figures in her own talk, we were constantly reminded why chastity is such an important part of this, right? So even romantic love in the mystical Christian tradition was still founded on the chastity of the speaker, right? This is quite different from the Punjabi folk poets I'm talking about, because for them very clearly, although chastity is an admirable goal, very often that is not what their poetry celebrates.
Okay, thank you. What about the contemporary listeners and performers? So what meanings do they assign to the Sufi poetry and music they perform? Are they concerned with the ethical debates of the previous centuries?
I think if I gave this talk in Delhi or Lahore, this would be shocking to most of the audience. One of the reasons for this is, I often say we become strangers to our own past, partly because of colonization, but also because many of the languages in which this poetry is written is not immediately accessible to contemporary audiences. And I would say a certain Puritanism that keeps it from getting into the school curricula where people can cultivate an understanding and appreciation for it. Although people have heard of Bulleh Shah, Waris Shah, Madhur Shah Hussain, very often they're not as familiar with what some of these symbolic ideas are. Waris Shah's poetry is very, very explicit. So in public performances, sometimes things get edited out. And those lovely pictures I showed you, the portraits of this is a modern telling. None of those men actually probably even look like that. Bulleh Shah is certainly described very differently in the textual accounts he offers of himself. And Madhur Shah Hussain, what was called a Mazhubi poet, was certainly not this dignified, elderly, sober-bearded dude we are seeing in these pictures. He is described as hanging out in the streets of Lahore, quaffing wine with his followers. He had shaved off his beard, hair, and eyebrows, and was flirting with boys in the streets. And for him, there was nothing wrong with this, because to explore different dimensions of the human experience is to experience God's creation and all the bewildering variety and joy that can be had within it. So in some senses, I think the new reading by LGBTQ scholars, even though it has often been criticized by historians and literary experts as modern, in a way is not recognizing that, in fact, stripping them down to a spiritual, physical bipolarity is in itself a modern trope, right? And for the early modern experience, ideas of physicality, sentiment, erotic love are very different. So in order not to be strangers to our own past, I would think a contemporary Indian or Pakistani poetic audience would need to actually explore the symbolism behind these poems a little bit more. Certainly, it's becoming more widespread now with this renewed youthful movement and interest in it. We'll see where it goes.
Okay. We have another, actually a few questions that touch on the contemporary situation. So what are the possibilities for gender fluidity in the present Indian Pakistan? And another related question, how is LGBTQ communities treated in Pakistan today?
Right. So this is very complex, because culturally, South Asia has always had gender fluid communities that had a place in ritual practice, including groups like the Hijras, for example, who present in gender non-conforming ways and are very integral to rituals that involve birth, marriages, and celebrations where they will come and perform. But despite that, there are deep wells of homophobia and transphobia in South Asia, so I don't want to sell an unreal picture. More recently, the Indian Supreme Court voided the old colonial sodomy acts and began to actually move towards a pathway of granting rights and human rights protections to LGBTQ groups. The Pride Parade I showed you in Lahore was about a similar situation in which more protection and rights have been offered. But as we know, all too sadly, even in the United States, offering legal protection and creating a safe zone for these communities is not the same thing, right? And to a certain extent, I think one of the reasons activists have really turned to this poetry is because it bridges the gap between a poetic tradition that is non-threatening and deeply familiar to Punjabi audiences, and yet has elements in it which also valorize, validate, and endorse the space that all people should have to express their sexuality and their gender persona. So it's an ongoing battle. There's much work that needs to be done on this still.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question. How do we know how this queer relations, specifically Mother Shah Hussein, were perceived by their peers?
So obviously, they survived because somebody documented it. It was not completely silenced or effaced in the early modern period. And we have these Persian biographies that are actually celebrating their love for each other. But we know also from these sources, not just Madhu Shah Hussain, but his own teacher, who was of a similar orientation, were persecuted. And at various times, they are brought into the Mughal royal court, which used to circulate. And there are some very funny scenes that are described in this hagiography where the Emperor Akbar calls them because, local neighbors and qazis, and there's sometimes their own Islamic legal theory students have accused them of improper, inappropriate, or immoral behavior. And every time, the emperor, after listening both sides of these stories, both in the actual historical testimony as well as in these hagiographic accounts, say, well, how do you know this? And the question is, did you actually violate their privacy into peering into their houses and their intimate gatherings to report on that? Well, that's a violation of the Sharia also, right? And legal procedure. And in fact, they're allowed to go. So in actual fact, although we do have accounts of non-conforming behavior being very severely punished by some Mughal emperors, in the case of these Punjabi poets, they seem to have gotten around with it and also flourished, in part because of imperial protection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And here's the question about the British rule and the time during the British rule. So what was the perception?
So we have scholars in the audience who are perhaps more qualified to speak to it. But certainly, under British rule, a lot of this behavior was strictly policed. Sodomy laws that were written in the legal codes of England were imported into colonial India. Other than that, there was also very strict inspection of performing communities. So these would be musicians, artists, courtesans' family, where many LGBTQ groups were gathered, where using public health and public morality as a legal concept, there was considerable state intervention where people would be inspected, institutionalized, removed from those settings. And to some extent, I would say the vestiges of that kind of morality and policing is still very much alive in South Asia today. And partly because so many of these colonial laws still exist on the books. So the sodomy laws have been done away with, but not the laws that permit these kinds of policing behaviors. And in fact, that still remains a cause of considerable concern because the afterlife of these colonial laws permits policemen, but also other so-called reform-minded moral activists in communities to use those legal procedures to police behavior today. So while there is one legal tradition that is expanding rights, there is also another group and another force that is trying to reenact those very same kinds of policing mechanisms that were embodied in colonial law.
Okay, and two more questions. Is the Sufi tradition stronger today in areas of Pakistan or India?
That would be a hard one to answer. One of the reasons being that one can be a Sufi and still be many other things, right? In other words, religious identities in South Asia are not mutually exclusive, right? They're not thought of as homogeneous unitary confessional identities. And in Pakistan, in more recent years, a lot of these shrines have been targeted by more conservative groups. They have been the site of terrorist attacks. This has happened on occasion in India as well. So people often express their religious beliefs more privately. But certainly, I know, particularly in my own research and particularly in public gatherings like these Sufi communities, even people who self-identify as very orthodox observant Muslims are intimately familiar with this tradition of Sufi poetry and musical norms. And quite a few of them are quite tolerant of it, right? So there was a period in the 40s, 50s, and 60s where modern reformers were trying to get rid of all of this, right, as a part of a dead, moribund, early modern medieval tradition. That is no longer the case. And particularly as South Asian Muslims want to explore Islam in culturally relevant ways, they are becoming much more attuned to the indigenous forms of Islamic expression.
And are all the poets that you mentioned in your lecture buried in Pakistan? And
The ones I specifically talked about today are, but we have many others that are on the Indian side of the border. And one of the odd things that has happened on the Indian side is many of the caretakers of these shrines left for Pakistan or Bangladesh during partition. And what happened on the Indian side of Punjab is the caretakers of those shrines came from local low-caste communities. Many of them didn't convert to Islam, but they have kept the shrines going, right? So it allows then for pilgrims from Pakistan, in the slim possibilities of when they get a visa, to come visit and pay their respect to their ancestral shrines.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Purnima, thank you for a very interesting lecture.